When Missouri became a state 200 years ago in 1821, it already had its government in place. It had elected its first governor the year before, and the name of the winner is hardly a household name today, but almost everybody's heard of the loser. William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. Famous now, famous then. And yet when it came time to elect the state's first governor, William Clark was, to put it mildly, trounced. The Lewis and Clark expedition, the core of discovery, was an amazing achievement, which the people of that time probably realized even more than we do. It made Lewis and Clark national figures, national heroes even. But then they stayed on in St. Louis, not as heroes, but as territorial officials. William Clark first handled Indian affairs, and then after Meriwether Lewis's death, Clark became the territorial governor. So in 1820, with the first governor's race coming up, he had his admirers, he had his detractors.
There was an interesting little blurb in the newspaper during that year close to the election, and it said something about Lewis and Clark were heartily sick of Lewis and Clark, hearing about Lewis and Clark. Clark was really the head of a political faction in St. Louis. He was, we would almost consider him to be like a political boss today.
His opponent in that first governor's race was Alexander McNair.
McNair wasn't like a mortal enemy of Clark or anything like that, but I think a lot of the things that Clark had done while he was territorial governor kind of became issues in the campaign.
There were issues, but slavery wasn't one of them. Missouri was entering as a slave state, and Clark himself was a slave owner. The bigger issues dealt with settlers and Indians. McNair had been a land agent working in the interests of settlers seeking more land. But Clark's job was to work with the Indian tribes, at times preventing encroachment on their tribal lands. William Clark was seen as soft on the Indian question.
But the people in the state felt that their best interests in terms of American Indian affairs would be represented by having a governor that wasn't sort of tainted by having been part of the federal regime.
Much of this story took place in the new state's biggest city and population center on what is now the Arch Grounds. In 1820, Alexander McNair was taking his campaign to the people, to the taverns. Clark's campaign? Half-hearted. His wife, Julia, was seriously ill and was back at her parents' home in Virginia.
So Clark actually took a trip to Virginia and spent much of the year with her, and she died that year. So by the time he got back to St. Louis, a lot had gotten out of hand in terms of, how he was being represented.
It wasn't even close. McNair got more than twice as many votes, 6,576 to Clark's 2,556. William Clark stayed in St. Louis and remained important, serving as the federal government's superintendent of Indian affairs during America's westward expansion. McNair served his one term as governor and took a job as an Indian agent, but he died a short time later at the age of 50. He's buried in Calvary Cemetery. A new stone was placed here as part of Missouri's centennial in 1921. But Alexander McNair today is something of a bicentennial trivia answer. And the winner of that first governor's race comes in a distant second when it comes to monuments. Just across the road is the impressive grave of William Clark. Clark's life is under constant re-examination, his role in the treatment of Native Americans and his resistance to freeing his slave York, who served with the Corps of Discovery. But this is still the most visited gravesite in Bellefontaine Cemetery. For Living St. Louis, I'm Jim Kircher.